Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our Change webinar series, Building Change Capability Throughout the Organization. My name is Murav Amit, and I'm a consultant at Curve Group, and I will be your host for today's session. Can I just start by asking if everybody can hear us okay? Yep, great. So the topic we will be discussing today has been selected based on the poll results of our Part 1 Change webinar, Redefining Change Today, where we asked participants to vote for the topic that would benefit them most in their organization. 75% of our participants selected this topic. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to cover a few housekeeping items to make sure the session together runs as smoothly as possible. The structure of our webinar will include a presentation, which will run for 40 minutes, and then we will carry out a Q&A session. There is a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, which you can use to send in your questions. Please send in your questions throughout the presentation rather than waiting until the end, as this gives us an opportunity to collate the questions and make the most of the Q&A session. While we do our best to address your questions, we apologize in advance if time does not allow for it. We will, however, make every effort to follow up with you after the webinar. In addition, we will provide you with today's slides after the webinar, should you wish to share them with others. The link to the webinar recording will also be made available on our website. Please feel free to send communications throughout the chat function if you are having any issue throughout the webinar or require technical assistance. To give you just a little bit of background on Curve Group, we're a business improvement consulting firm with expertise in people, culture and change, and a focus on enabling people strategy. Here we have shared our service framework to show you where today's topic fits in terms of areas in which we work. There are 3 key service areas you can see there, and the first one in blue is Inform, which is about clarifying business challenges through diagnostic activities such as assessment, strategic facilitation, functional reviews, and workforce planning. In green, we have Create, which is about aligning people to strategy, and it includes areas of work such as organizational design, performance culture, people strategy and talent, and capability work. And finally, in yellow, we have Activate, which is about enabling disciplined execution, and the areas of work there include program setup, project management, change management, and team effectiveness work. Our discussion today will focus on change, but we'll touch upon parts of our service offerings such as change management, capability work, performance culture, and strategic facilitation, to name a few. So, to get us started, I would like to introduce our panel, Nicole and Monika Fritz, both of which are senior consultants in Curve Group, and Lucy Richards, General Manager of Smiling Mind, who we are thrilled to be partnering with for part 2 of our Change webinar series. I'll now pass on to each member of our panel to share a little bit about themselves and how they will contribute to our webinar discussion today. Nick, would you like to start?
Thanks, Murav, for the great introduction. My name is Nicole Spiller. I've been with Curve Group over the last 4 years, particularly specialising in working with organisations who are going through large-scale transformation. Something that I'm really passionate about is ensuring that employees, no matter how large or small an organisation that they come from, have the ability, the skills and the tools to be able to deal with change. So that's a little bit about me and why I'm really excited about today's webinar.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Mon?
Yeah, hi, welcome everyone, and welcome back to those of you who are with us on our first webinar. And for those of you I didn't sort of get to introduce myself to then, my name is Monika Fritz and I have joined Curve Group early this year in about January, but my background really lies in working largely across the public sector in terms of looking at change programs and supporting leaders and employees through those change programs across the public sector, more recently in the private sector. But a little bit like Nick, I think change is, although we talk about it being organisational, it's always personal, and so from the background I come from, I certainly have a fairly strong focus on making, sure that employees and individuals and leaders and all aspects of that business have a voice in the change process. So, yeah, probably time to introduce yourself, Lucy. I might hand over to you. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Mon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the General Manager at Smiling Mind, which is a modern meditation app that is focusing around building the capacity of people to manage day-to-day life. And as we know, change is a huge and increasing part of life. So I'm really thrilled to be here with Curve Group today to talk about the intersection of well-being and technology and then how that can link in with change. As my broader interests, I am very passionate about creating behaviour change and culture change and looking at ways that we can manage that effectively and empower people through that process. So thanks.
Thank you, Lucy.
Finally, this is the structure for our discussion today. Let's start with Nick, who will talk us through the first topic, capability, a key lever for successful change.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marav. To get us off to a really great start, we thought we'd connect with Webinar 1, which was about redefining change today. In Webinar 1, we talked just about the pace of change, how it's increased, how the complexity of it is also increasing, both within organisations, but also more broadly from a society perspective, due to things like technology innovation, complex markets, globalised markets, but also in the way in which we're constantly evolving how we live as a society, how we communicate. We all have smartphones. We use things like social media, Skype, which enables us to see people from across the world and actually talk to them. It's instant, it's fast, and we like it to be shorter and sharper. We also use technology and are constantly changing the way in which we do things such as household chores, the way in which we understand health and nutrition and how to look after ourselves. We come from a society that has more information that's accessible to more people than ever, and people want to use that information to get the best that they can and to live the life in the best way that they can. We also have therefore changed the way in which we work, and that was a really big focus of webinar number 1. You know, it's not simply about change equaling job loss or change meaning we're talking about restructuring an organisation. We're significantly changing the way in which we work from a systems perspective, a process perspective, how we travel, how we connect, how organisations are spread out geographically. And that then impacts our people, our workforce. What are the skills and the capability that we need to make sure that that can work? From an organisational perspective, many of the businesses that we're working with are needing to be more agile. They need to match their customers' needs. They're continually looking for new ways of working to improve their efficiency and to save costs while ensuring that they still keep that quality. The types of changes that we discussed in Webinar 1 really looked at, okay, how do we now help organisations tackle this broader range of changes that they're facing, and often at the same time? Whether again it's, you know, those system changes, or it's how do we make sure that we're creating an organisation that takes into account multiple different cultures, both organisational cultures but also geographical cultures. We've got different types of leadership emerging, and we're looking at brands that are becoming, you know, merged with already established brands and then emerging new brands that are coming into the market. The list goes on for the type of changes that we're facing, and when we're building change capability, we're not simply talking about building leaders' ability anymore to just have an outcomes conversation when someone loses their job, or to help employees understand that change is going to happen and you need to get on board and get on the ship or off it. So here's a change curve to help guide you through that. It's not as simple as that anymore. Many of the organisations we're working with are looking to develop and foster an organisational culture that's able to move confidently through uncertainty, to be able to adapt, bounce back and respond with agility while still ensuring quality and high performance. It's quite a challenge, one that we're really excited by, but that we can see, you know, causes a lot of issues. There are many positives to the way in which we're constantly looking for better ways, but there are also challenges that go with that. Living in a world that's constantly on, that's constantly stimulated, needing to challenge itself, try new things and change how we are doing, our simple everyday activities takes a toll. And Lisa, I'd be really interested in hearing how you're seeing across society, whether it's in corporate life, schools, sporting teams or even in the community, how that pace of life and that level of change is impacting on people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly evident. We're very overstimulated as people. There's that constant need to check phones, to check emails, to be in contact and communication with people, and it's certainly not all negative. I think it's important to not look at this as a negative thing because it's certainly here to stay. So in that sense, it's how can we use technology for good rather than evil? I think that it's very easy to can technology, see it as negative and a big monster that's taking over our lives. And the way that Smiling Mind has done that, it's certainly about how can you use technology to engage people and then support them in highly accessible and cost-effective ways. And you talk about, Nick, you talked about that instantaneous way of life that we're often leading, and I think that highlights that in terms of building change capability, it's really about building an individual's capacity to manage it within the moment-to-moment level, so you can manage that instantaneous way that we tend to live our lives.
Yeah, and I think it really just points us to Lucy's point around we need to actually help people develop skills to create capacity, but also to make that mindset shift.
Yeah.
We need to equip them with practical and simple strategies and tools, whether it's using technology, which we may as well since we're changing so rapidly with it, to help them deal with it, to navigate it confidently, and to make sure that whatever challenge they face, that they feel confident to go through that challenge and really, I guess, take it by the horns.
Feel empowered, yeah.
Yeah, feel empowered, exactly. So that's what brought us to today's webinar, which is really focusing on, instead of, a lot of organisational change focuses on business levers such as process. So what's our change process? What's our communication strategy? How are we using our leaders to share that case for change? What's the way in which we're creating a feedback loop? But today we wanted to focus on the lever of capability because we think that's the most important to first develop to enable all of the other levers. If we haven't first helped develop leaders' ability to communicate effectively, to sell a vision, to be empathetic, to understand how people deal with change, then it's going to be really hard to use that lever of communication or use that lever of leadership. So that's how we came up with today's webinar, which is really about how do we focus on change capability as a lever. And when we talk about that lever, it's about making sure, to Lucy's point, that we've created the right mindset in our people. Is our workforce resilient enough? Do they have the ability from a mindset perspective to focus on what they can control, what they can influence? And do they have the ability to manage that level of distress and anxiety that sometimes do go with changes? Do they have the understanding and knowledge of the common reactions to change? None of us are immune to changes. We all go through a psychological and physiological process when they occur. We want to make sure that we use that knowledge as power to help people understand within themselves, be self-aware and able to identify, but most importantly, continue to move forward. Do they have the key skills to either lead, navigate or manage change effectively? We're going to talk throughout the webinar about the different types of skills that are needed for different roles that are played in an organisation throughout a change. And finally, really focusing on some of those tools and strategies. So do people have simple tools, technologies, but also programs and skill development workshops or e-learns to help them deal with that level of ambiguity, but also most importantly, feel empowered. Throughout the webinar today, we'll be exploring these key different elements of change capability and really breaking it down by workforce area. The different roles in which I alluded to just now include leaders. So what do we mean by change leadership? What does that look like from a skills perspective for senior leaders versus middle managers who often have to really make the change stick, to our frontline leaders who are often customer facing, not only leading their teams through change but also leading customers of an organisation through change. There's key change skills that we want to make sure that we're developing ongoing, not just for an event, not just for a type of change that's occurring right now, but to make sure that that's a key skill set in any leadership program within an organisation. We're going to take a deep dive into the critical role of being a change manager or a change agent. We understand most organisations don't actually have the capacity to have change managers work within their organisation. It's often left to HR and particularly HR BPs to really concentrate on how do we make sure the process of the change continues smoothly, that it doesn't impact on other parts of the way in which we're running the organisation. It's a critical skill set and one that we need to make sure is in parallel to the change process. It's not one or the other. We need to focus on both. And finally, our last section will be about how do we build change capability within employees. We think this is a critical part of the workforce to really allow for that agility. So to kick things off, we're going to hand over to Mon to really focus on that HR and change manager capabilities there.
Thanks, Nick. I think you've done an amazing job in terms of setting the scene of how much it's on the agenda of everyone today. And certainly when we start to talk about HR and change managers supporting and guiding others through change, they really do have a very critical role. As we all know, they're often brought in at the beginning of that change process, so they need to bring with them a set of fairly unique skills, which obviously I will talk about, but also a mindset which helps them to think about that change systemically as well as individually. And then also a bunch of strategies and tools that are going to support their process as they go along. And I think Nick put it really well when she said it's not just about having a change process. And as you all know, we can all have a change process in front of us, but it is certainly about how we use our own abilities to bring that process to life and make that meaningful. But before we talk about some of those key skills, I just want to touch on the mindset or the mental approach of HR. We talk about HR or change managers, but I think Nick said it really well earlier too when we say many organisations don't have the funds to employ change managers. So I use the term, loosely between HR, change managers, project managers. Sometimes it's key leaders, but irrespective of what role you sit in, they're the similar skills that you need. The mindset that's really required is one which starts to look at that change and consider the change from a systemic level. And what we mean by that is, what is the impact of this change across the whole of the business? And that means that they need to be able to look to identify issues really early. In fact, if you remember in our first webinar, we highlighted the need for change to have that integrated approach that actually speaks to business outcomes. That integrated approach really starts at this point in time. It starts with that systemic mindset. Interestingly, we worked recently with an organisation that were looking to implement some new technologies. And, the change manager took on board the recommendations of IT, who said, look, this is a great technology, we recommend you move forward on this, and they certainly moved forward with the recommendations from IT, but possibly hadn't quite calculated on the impact of that technology across other areas of the business. So what that meant was that as they got further down the change process, the channels required to implement the technology, the capabilities required to utilise that technology weren't as adequately planned for, both from a financial and an operational point of view. So actually approaching that change from a far more systemic, integrated approach is certainly the mindset that change managers need to begin any change process with. But even with that mindset, really when we start to then think about particular skills they need, we talk about, having some fairly well-developed communication skills, some negotiation negotiating skills, some influencing skills. It all sounds fairly high level, but we know that the early engagement and influencing of stakeholders is critical in any change process. Some of the key challenges that come across with any change, and certainly been my experience, has been you can roll out a process, but if you're not managing the impact of those changes on your stakeholders well, then the level of resistance and kickback that you get often means that the change doesn't get embedded and integrated. So it's very critical for professionals who are suddenly thrown into a change manager role to actually consider what skills do they have in that influencing and communication abilities so that they can actually engage those conversations really early. You know, good change managers, what we see is that they're always asking the question, are we on the same page? What do I understand of what this change means to you? What do you understand of what the change means to me? Because only through that constant asking can there be a level of responsiveness and agility in terms of the change. So we know good planning and execution is needed, but the reality is change is messy. It never really goes totally as planned. So if you're in a change process and it's not going as planned, I think that's a part of change. What we know though is that good change managers again can bring a level of flexibility and respond to those issues and problems early. So allow them to be identified and resolved in a timely way rather than allowing them to fester. What we know is that if we're guiding and supporting others, because if you think about it, change managers are not just guiding and supporting others. They're dealing with their own responses to the change. They're dealing with their own feelings and thoughts about that, as well as guiding others, as well as often leading leaders through that. So having the capacity and the ability to maintain perspective is a really important skill that change managers bring to that process. Being able to keep their eye on the benefits for the business, the longer term business goals and objectives, while still supporting people at a very individual level. You know, in a recent example where we saw that being done well, and we're currently working with a large organisation that I would say are doing that really well, the change manager has set up some tools and systems on regular feedback loops. So after each change process is implemented, there is an automatic feedback loop, and although there's a consistency in messaging, there is also a capacity to tailor things slightly when your audience changes or responds slightly differently to the change. So it's not as easy as saying I have a process and I'll follow this process, because without that level of flexibility and agility, you know, organisations we find are really struggling to actually use their tools in a way that makes them responsive and continues to remain agile because our audiences are changing. So that probably, you know, leads us to sort of think a little bit more about some of the key takeaways in relation to HR and change managers. And, you know, from my perspective, I think it's fairly clear that organisations need to invest in building change management skills. And, you know, whether it's in their HR function or their change leaders, project managers or other leaders, those organisations we see that are investing in building this skill set are seeing the payoff far more than those that, you know, are still thinking it's just a process that needs to continue. It's not just about it being a process, you know, it's about being able to build the skills to affect a good process. And also it's about having that balance between walking into that with an early and stable plan, but with a flexible approach that's going to support some identification of the issues, some resolution, but also constant communication of the challenges. So the tools that we use are supporting those key abilities that we need to remain agile in that space. So probably the point now to hand back over in terms of some of the leadership stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important definition between what is change management, as Mon talked to, and what are the skills needed to do that really well, and then what is change leadership. In a lot of our workshops that we run with change leaders, they say, oh, but I'm managing the change. Actually, they're really different. So what we define as change management is about, as Mon talked to, the what and the how of change. What is my process? How do I make sure that it continues, that there's little impact as possible on the other parts of the business, but we make sure that change is a success. Change leadership, though, is about the why. Why are we changing? And how do we bring people on that journey? How do we capture their hearts and minds? And an added one for us, as you'll see in the image, is also their hands, or what we need them to do from an action perspective. Change leadership is a critical skill set that we think all organisations need to develop at all levels of their leadership profile. One of the things that we've seen done really well in an organisation recently was really clearly articulated by one of the leaders' employee groups that we ran a workshop with. And some of the things that they talked about were not about, oh, he's been really good at explaining the process to us or making sure that we hit all of our goals. It was about the fact that they talked about their leader understanding each of their situations and what the change meant to them, that they felt really comfortable to go and talk to him, that they felt like he genuinely cared for their situation, whether it was specifically at work in their job, but also what the change meant to them for their whole life. They talked about him understanding the different personality types and how they reacted. And they also talked about, yeah, we know we don't have all of the information yet, but it'll come. There weren't the levels of anxiety that we sometimes see working with different employee groups. And that was pretty strongly put down to the leader's ability to create that trust with the group, to really invest his time and energy into having one-on-ones with his whole team, and seeing the importance of, if we really connect with people, not necessarily having all of the information about a change, but making sure we're communicating with them regularly and consistently and engaging with them, and making sure that we genuinely care for them and they feel that it's going to really help the change be a success. So when we then talk about some of the challenges that go with being a leader during change, and there's a few, it also then helps us to focus on some key skills that we think are important to develop. So one of the things that Mon's already talked to is a key leadership challenge during change is most leaders are actually going through the change themselves first as an individual, and then they're needing to play a really critical role of leading others through it, providing guidance and support. As you'll see on your screen, some of the key capability focus areas we think is important is to get to leaders early, as early as we can, to make sure that they're ready, that they've had the time and space to actually work through, what does the change mean to me? What's my understanding of my own common reactions to it, and how do I accelerate that? It's really important to have a good level of self-awareness, but also then to understand how they can support their team through that. Coaching skills are critical. One of the other challenges that we see, particularly in middle and frontline levels of leadership, is they haven't necessarily been a part of the decision making of the change, but they have to be the ones who champion it and make it happen. It's critical to make sure we build a mindset, but also the skills to ensure that leaders take personal accountability for that situation, that they know how to own it and the choice that they have in how they behave, but also that they have key communication and engagement skills. As I talked to, one of the examples that we've seen of this done really well is of that consistency in how they engage, of how they can really make sure that their messages are through loud and clear. But most importantly, it's about selling. That's a really critical skill set for many leaders in an organisation around how they're able to sell that change. I think one of the challenges, though, that we've seen more recently has been about, we're really seeing that a lot of leaders are feeling a bit of change fatigue. Often leaders as individuals actually cope with change quite well. But when organisations are going through ongoing large transformation, even they can start to get wary, and it can be frustrating, and particularly when they're struggling to get people on board. I'd love to hear your input on this, Luce, but about how we can develop leaders' ability to really tap into that emotion and manage it, but use it to channel them forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before I get to that, I think for those of you, as particularly who are online today, who are working within organisations, it's the important thing to realise is that that building capacity doesn't just happen overnight, and it's something that's highly preemptive. So it's not about actually waiting until the change happens. It's actually something that you can start to do now. And that, then talking to your point, Nick, is around, what are the sort of the conversations that you have with people that start to build their awareness of the organisation. They start to feel their value within the organisation. They start to feel more connected with their role and also with their managers and colleagues around them. And if you can begin to build that, a sense of value, a sense of awareness within an individual, when change comes along, they're much more adaptable, they're on your side, and they've got an increased capacity to deal with it, to be flexible. That change fitness, I love that term that you guys use here at Curve. And from a management perspective, I truly believe in, and I've seen the benefits of a leader being able to connect with themselves, because it's only once they have that true connection, understanding of their own values, their own part within the change process, that they're able to then communicate and get others on board.
And refocus, I'd imagine, as well, for those times when change fatigue does come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sort of skills, that I think from a Smiling Mind perspective, we focus a lot on the mind side of this change, and in building even awareness, things like empathy can grow, and compassion, and even a sense of gratitude within the organisation. And I think that they're things that are often overlooked.
Yeah, thanks, Luce. And I think to your point, one of the key takeaways for developing change leadership capabilities, that third one, which is around ensuring that you've got an early, practical and cascaded approach to leadership development. And it's not about just working on the here and now and the change event that we're facing, but it's about how do we develop that ongoing? How is that a part of our leadership development? And it doesn't have to be workshops and programs. It's about how do we set up peer networks of support to help make sure that people have outlets, to help make sure that people have the ability to look after their own well-being and really connect and coach one another as a leadership group. I think it's a really critical thing to make sure that we're allowing leaders to make that mindset shift, to really connect with themselves first and understand change within themselves first before they have that ability to lead others. To delve a little bit further into some of the ways in which we can manage wellbeing, we'll hand back over to Mon to explore how we develop employee capability, but particularly around some of those key need areas.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I think it's interesting because you've probably said earlier, and I think it's true to say that when it comes to developing employees' understanding and capabilities to navigate change, historically it's not something organisations have been very good at. But I would also say that, as a society as a whole, we probably haven't been very good at it. And there's certainly a lot more research now which lets us have a greater insights into the impact and, how we can actually look to build on some of that research to manage those situations and build some understanding for employees at a greater level. It wasn't that long ago, I remember, you'd have a change and basically there'd be, a bit of a key message from organisations, get on board or get out, really. And so I think that we've come a long way in that sense. And it's funny because I still think there's sometimes a bit of a lingering sense of, change isn't personal, it's organisational. But, as Nick was reminding me this morning, and I don't think I can do it quite in the same way Nick does, but, it's that famous line from the Godfather movie of, it's not personal, it's strictly business. I think you did it much better for me. But effectively, that's often the key message that organisations give. They say, oh, it's not personal, it's business. But the reality is change is personal. It is personal because it impacts people personally. And the first step in understanding employees and navigating change is about understanding that and actually appreciating the fact that it is personal, because as you can see on your slide at the moment, when organisations fail to do that, there are some fairly significant organisational impacts which really do start to affect their bottom line and start to have an impact whereby productivity is impacted and organisations don't do as well, and then they wonder why. So certainly it's important to keep in mind how are you actually going to do that. what we see is that organisations that are working well to support employees through change, they're actually taking a very proactive approach. They're providing employees with an opportunity to actually have some frameworks, and I've put some of them up on your key slide at the moment, which actually help to educate and give them a level of self-awareness of what are some of the common reactions and responses that we all have to change. You know, that it is normal for us to have, and how can we actually create a space in which people can work through the internal psychological processes associated with change and do so in a way that they feel safe and supported, because that will assist any change and any change process to be able to move forward as opposed to become a bit stuck. And you know, we will all know situations and cases where people do sometimes become stuck in change and can't let go of the way things used to be. So a number of these processes and these frameworks we would use, and certainly whether it's the William Bridges model around transition or whether it's processes that, you know, talk to Stephen Covey's circle of concern and circle of influence, by helping employees to understand some of these simple tools and frameworks that help them to think, where am I going to focus my energy? You know, where is it going to be useful for me to maintain my well-being if I'm going to manage myself through this change? Because we know that with any change, there's lots of bits in that change that we actually can't control. And helping, you know, employees understand what does it mean to be accountable for our own behaviours through that change process, and how do I maintain my well-being so that I can respond in a way that continues to make me build my self-esteem in myself and hold myself to where I want to be. There's certainly, you know, a lot of research now which indicates that even when change processes don't go well, when people take on board key messages of no longer being useful and no longer behaving in the way they would anticipate, that the impact is a very personal impact and has some significant implications not only for the organisation but obviously for the well-being of the individual, which really does, you know, bring me to the fact that, you know, the changing game at the moment in this field is the fact that we need to think about how do we build sustainable skills. How do organisations have that level of sustainable agility that enables people to build some change fitness and cope with not one change, not two changes, but a level of ongoing change? And what does that mean? And there's now a lot of new research in the areas of positive psychology, mindfulness, meditation that has been brought to this area that helps to give us some insight, which is probably a time to sort of hand to you, Lucy, and ask, what's your key learning or suggestions in terms of how are organisations, you know, how can organisations help their people prepare themselves and manage some of these aspects of change fatigue?
Sure, thanks, Mon. I loved what you were talking about earlier in terms of normalising the process and normalising change for people. I think that's really important. And part of what Smiling Mind aims to do in our messaging is linking the mind and the body, because we all know that we're supposed to eat well and exercise to keep our body fit and healthy, but it's just important to look after our minds as well and keep them fit and healthy. And as you touched on, mindfulness meditation is a really proven, a clinically proven tool to support that process. And Smiling Mind has worked with quite a number of psychologists, both clinical psychologists and organisational psychologists, to build programs that support that mental well-being and mental fitness, to build an ability to manage stress, to build resilience, and then to also, on the other side of it, is increasing productivity and change. So that mental well-being piece is so important, and something that I've learned in terms of just managing people's day-to-day capacity to deal with the stresses of everyday life. And something that in terms of suggestions for organisations to help people prepare themselves, I really think that it takes a cross-organisational approach where you're dealing with, as we've touched on, leaders, but then also looking at people at a grassroots and a community level as well, so everyone is on the same page.
Yeah. And I think it's probably a really interesting time to talk to you, the audience. So we'd love to know, within your organisations at the moment, how many of you are actually utilising mindfulness, or it might be meditation practices, to help enable your employees ability to focus, to manage stress, but most importantly to look after yourself. So we're just going to launch a poll, and while we're doing that, Lisa, it'd be really interesting to hear what you're seeing from a corporate perspective locally versus internationally around those practices.
Sure. And just as a very brief overview of what actually is mindfulness, what is this concept? One of the best ways to describe it is what it's not and its opposite, and that is mindlessness. And we all experience that on a day-to-day basis, and we forget where we put our keys or our phone, or you're reading something and halfway down the page you realise you haven't actually taken in what is going on. We can often live our lives on default mode, and from a productivity point of view, that's fairly clear as to why something like mindfulness is relevant. But then looking at it from a mental well-being point of view, when we get into mindless thought processes and habits, it can be quite destructive, and it actually can end up leading to mental health issues.
And also, just to add to that, in a number of the organisations that we work with that have a real operational focus, safety is number one, you know, as a business measure, and of course it should be. When we're talking about mindlessness and not focusing, you know, it really brings that safety piece to the forefront. So when we've got people operating machinery or transportation vehicles, you know, how critical it is to make sure that we equip people with the ability to make sure they're being mindful in all situations.
Absolutely. And then when you transform that into a management point of view, or even just between colleagues, we all know how disconcerting and disengaging it is when you're having a conversation with someone and they're not really giving you their full attention. So that's certainly to be able to train individuals in mindfulness meditation and increase their capacity to be focused and present can help, again, as you said, on an operational level, but then also on an individual and a peer-to-peer level as well. And my experience of the way that corporate Australia and across the world as well is implementing mindfulness and mindfulness meditation within their workforces, that they're really adopting this as such an easy tool to be able to equip their staff with. And what it does is it also creates quite a significant culture shift, changes the way that people communicate with each other, changes their engagement with their work, and it creates a sense of flexibility and adaptivity, which of course is extremely relevant when you're talking about change.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I'll just share our poll results with the audience, and what the results show, we've had 30% say we're not using it at all, 50% and the majority say individuals within our organisation are using it, which is really fantastic and really exciting for us in the room. And then we have 20% who are saying they're already using it as part of a learning program within the organisation. We're not quite at the stage of having it being a key organisational behaviour, but those results definitely show that there's a lot of hope, and hopefully with fantastic, accessible, practical technologies like Smiling Minds app, we can continue to develop that.
Yeah. And I think, what's important is also to recognise that when we're talking about employees and, helping them to get through it, we also have to consider the different generations we're dealing with. Clearly there are different approaches and there are different strategies depending on whether, you're a Gen X or whether you're a baby boomer or what you are, but critically important to think about how are we tailoring it to make sure that it's meaningful for the people that we're actually working with.
Goes back to your normalisation piece as well. It's certainly there's still stigmas that are around what actually is mindfulness meditation. Is it something that I need to sit cross-legged and do? On a mountaintop. But absolutely not in terms of the research that's out there. And Smiling Mind actually did some preliminary research with one of Australia's biggest tech organisations, and we found statistically significant evidence to show that practising mindfulness, even just a couple of times a week, reduced perceived stress levels in their employees.
Fantastic, fantastic. So it's probably important to recognise that it is really useful for organisations to invest in preparing employees for change. without that, what we see is the impacts on the organisation. But also the fact that the recent research really highlights the importance of not just some of the practical skills, tools and strategies, but, how we can actually do that in a way to tailor it to ensure some well-being and mindfulness so people continue to actually be able to keep their own sense of well-being through that change process, given that it's a bit non-relenting at the moment. Always good as a final remember to keep in mind that people are our greatest resource, and that, if we can support people to understand and manage themselves and their responses and their own well-being, then we are actually building, the workforce, building our organisations, building the well-being of a nation, really. So critically important to keep in mind. There probably are 3 key takeaways.
Yeah, fantastic.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very informative, and I hope everybody enjoyed that. With the presentation part of the webinar now complete, we'd love to open up the conversation to you and explore some of the questions that have come throughout the discussion. So let's just go. We have a question. I'm an HRBP, and within my organisation we find it challenging to convince the business that change capability sessions are necessary. There's a strong belief that we simply don't have time or can't risk the investment. Do you have tips for how to overcome this challenge?
Well, I'm sure Nick will jump in at some point, but absolutely I think, it is the job of change managers to be able to link the investment that you're making to the business outcomes. And it was probably one of the key reasons why, that initial slide talked about the fact that, there's an impact on productivity, there's an impact on safety, there's an impact, probably the most common term used nowadays is presenteeism. When your employees are present but they're not really engaged. It's one of the key impacts from, ongoing change, and the fact that, we just don't have some capacity to process that. Now, in order to get leaders on board, we need to speak the language of business. That means it's your role to be able to link, this is what the research is telling us in relation to productivity. This is how this will, this is our increased absenteeism rates as an impact of poor change management processes. We see it all the time across organisations we work with, that, there's always a bit of a dip in productivity when change processes are brought in. The dip is significantly larger, and there's lots of research about which will back that up, but certainly it's important to find that critical links and the research and speak the language of outcomes and productivity to often be able to get leaders on board. Do you want to add anything to that, Nick?
I don't think I need to add anything to that. I think, Mon's point around speaking the business language. Yes, it's an investment, but it's a critical investment.
Yeah.
Change leaders who have experienced the impacts of when it isn't invested in will always make the time, find the money, if we're able to connect it with those critical business outcomes. So productivity, like Mon said, absenteeism, safety. Safety is a huge one for a lot of business leaders. Then you're going to be able to make a better case for making sure we're investing in people's change capability. I think the other key input there is it doesn't always have to be a workshop. There are a lot of different modes in which to help build this type of capability. Lisa's been talking quite a bit about how we utilise technology, apps. We've worked with a number of organisations to build whether they're e-learns to make sure that they have, whether it's national or global coverage, they've got consistent support available for all employees, but also all of their employees' family and friends that they can access from home. We can have different sorts of tools, hard copy, webinars such as this one. It doesn't necessarily always need to be a workshop, but we do truly think the workshop is worth an investment. But thank you for that question. I think it's one it's come through in a couple of different shapes and forms.
Another question, and thanks Nick and Mon, just to follow up from this one is, how do you make the investment tangible to link it to the productivity, safety, etc., or where have you seen this done well?
Yeah, go for it, Mon.
No, I'm absolutely happy for you to speak to this, Nick, but I was going to say, it's interesting that, we're all slow learners. Sometimes we get brought in because the last change went bad. and we have really clear, tangible evidence. And what I hear you saying is I want to be ahead of the ball game for my leaders, and it does take a level of, a bit of research to actually be looking at some tangible examples of where it hasn't gone well and where it's had significant impact. And certainly sometimes we have to look broader than our own organisation to find that evidence, but certainly it's out there. Maybe you want to add to that, Nick.
Yeah, I think the other critical thing there is it needs to be continually monitored. So in any type of change, but particularly when you're making a large-scale investment in capability, we need to make sure that we're continually reviewing. And when we're reviewing things like feedback for a program or attendance and all of those key things when we talk about, capability programs, we actually need to be straight away linking and reporting them, whether it's fortnightly or monthly to but how's the business performing as well. So whether it's absenteeism numbers, and we've seen some really great examples of just having almost project and review dashboards which have, here's our absenteeism numbers, here's our productivity, here's how we're tracking against our goals, here's how the change program is going from a feedback perspective, and trying to make those links as much as possible.
And I would agree with that, Nick, just with my tech hat on, and the ability for technology, if that's part of a solution that you implement, is the amount of data that you can capture from that. And that if you're an organisation who is hiring someone who's going to go through a change management process, or even if you're implementing your own solutions, is to really think about it at the beginning, what sort of data that can we capture, and question, think about what sort of data you want to capture as well in terms of all that feedback and building a case and tangible evidence.
Yeah, and it is a critical setup process, and travelling to the States last year and working with a few different organisations, it's a critical part of how in the United States business invest in any type of capability development program. There's always the early setup, what is the data that we need, what are the key questions that we want to answer, and how are we going to prove to the business that this is worth it, and reporting on that all of the way through. I think as Australia emerges from this pretty tough and challenging market, it's going to become even more critical. We need to be able to back up, particularly for HR and people and culture functions, we need to back everything up and make sure that we're linking it to how is this helping the business achieve what it needs to do at the end of the day. And I think we can really learn from some of the ways in which they do that over in the States.
Yeah, I'm only going to add 30 seconds to say, don't forget, as Lucy was saying, we don't have these capabilities overnight. So sometimes it does take partnering with people who have gone through this before to actually talk through these scenarios, to be able to actually think, what is this going to mean for me and how do I move forward?
Thank you. Thanks, Mom. Unfortunately, that's all we have time to cover off today. We want to make sure that we finish up by pulling together the key messages from today's session, but we will make sure that we touch base with those that have sent through questions that we haven't answered, and we will make sure that we answer them. Mom, would you like to just briefly take us through today's messaging?
In terms of some of the key messages for wrapping up today, really what we're saying is that it is really important to prepare the workforce, to actually look at their readiness and their ability to adapt to change, and how you're going to influence successfully change in your organisation, not only at the time when it happens but also as you move forward. So it's really important to think about that change readiness, and some of that is about the data points and actually looking at where you are and where you're going. But couldn't have spoken more clearly, and it's been fantastic to have Lucy on board today to really start to also talk to mindsets around what does it look like to have the mental and the physical well-being that is needed to make sure that we can sustain the change. We all know it's non-relenting nowadays. We all know we need a different level of well-being in order to manage it, and that's the same for everyone across the board. But actually putting that on the agenda, and we're trying to put that on the agenda sort of loud and proud today so that people actually think about well-being more overtly. And finally, being clear that there are different types of change capability, that it's important that different people in different roles, can develop those change capabilities and actually call them out and start to look at what does development in this area look like and what do I need to do to move forward.
Thank you, Mom. And just before we finish, Lucy, would you like to just talk to us through the Mindfulness corporate program that you're about to launch.
Thank you, Marav. Yes, so Smiling Mind has been lucky enough to work with IBM across Australia and New Zealand to develop a corporate program to support employees' mental well-being, and it is based in mindfulness meditation and looking at that, as we talked about, a highly preemptive tool to manage stress, build resilience, and then also help with that productivity and focus side of things. The app side of it to us is highly important because of its accessibility and also how cost effective it can be, and that it's something that's not limited to the workplace. So something that can go home and be used, you know, on the transport on the way to work. We've had examples also in bed before you go to sleep at night as a way to help switch off those thoughts and actually get away from emails for a small moment in the day. And then also it's something that can be shared with family as well, and Smiling Mind, actually talking to that preemptive point, our core business is working with young people in schools and the community, but we realise the importance of building the capacity of adults and within the workforce to manage stress and change, and then also live a more engaged and fulfilled life as well. So just a brief overview of the program. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, and part of the reason we wanted to partner with Smiling Mind today was, you know, throughout all of our change workshops and programs, we work with organisations on. We always mention Smiling Mind as an app when we you know, we're talking to people about different times when they're really feeling that challenge get to them. And the feedback around, you know, whether it's being on the tram or on the bus, you know, on the way to work, just to make sure I'm centred and refocus and to get my head into gear, or whether it's, you know, to really help them during those times of stress to make sure they're sleeping and getting what they need for their body, has been really positive. So, you know, it's been such a pleasure to have you on board today and as part of our panel discussion.
Thanks, Curve. Love being here.
Thank you so much. If anyone has any other further questions, you'd like to discuss any aspects of today's webinar further, please don't hesitate to contact us by email or phone, LinkedIn or Twitter. We're available on all of them, and we'd love to have a chat and answer any of your questions. So thank you all for joining us on our webinar today, Building Change Capability Throughout Your Organisation, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Have a great day, guys.